Welcome everyone to NSTA web seminars where you can find live interactive learning at your desktop. Tonight's presentation is part of our series on the NGSS cross-cutting concepts, and our focus today is on structure and function. Our presenters tonight are Cindy Hmelo-Silver and Rebecca Jordan. My name is Bryn Slate. I will be moderating the program, and we have Jeff Lehman online with us to provide technical support. Before we get started, I did want to remind everyone about visiting the NSTA Learning Center, which is your online portal for over 10,800 resources for science educators. And as those of our Learning Center users know, that we've got a number of resources available for free, and that resources can be added to your My Library area so that you can get to those when it's a good time for you. If you want to connect with other science teachers, we have community forums where you can discuss pertinent issues, including NGSS. And we do have online advisors who are available via our live support button. You can chat with them and get your questions answered about finding what you need there in the Learning Center. I'll also remind everybody about our free tools that we have that can help you organize your professional learning and document what you're doing. They're really a great resource, so I encourage you to take advantage of those this summer as you're working on your professional development plan for the next year. It is all available by going to learningcenter.nsta.org. And now, before I turn things over to our featured presenters today, I wanted to just recap some information about the development of the standards. And since we did have some folks who have not attended all of our web seminars, this is an opportunity to get everybody on the same page with NGSS. So just a quick recap here. So the standards were 4 organizations were involved in the development, including the National Academies, Achieve, NSTA, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And the standards were developed in a 2-part process that started in July 2011 with the development of this document, A Framework for K-12 Science Education. And this is really the document that you will want to familiarize yourself with and get to know, since it is the basis for NGSS. And you can get a free PDF or you can get a hard copy from the NSTA store, and I've got a link for everybody if you would like to find access to either of those. The PDF or the hard copy are accessible via the link that I just put into our chat window. And so the framework includes the scientific and engineering practices that we held a web seminar series on these last fall, and you can check out those archives by going to our website as well, and I'll put that link into our chat window. So the 8 scientific and engineering practices, as well as our cross-cutting concepts, which we're looking at tonight. So we've got 7 of those and web seminars on those as well. And then the third component are the disciplinary core ideas in life science, physical science, earth and space science, as well as engineering and technology. And each of those breaks down even further into even more specific detailed ideas under each category. Now, the second part of the process was the development of the standards themselves, and that was coordinated by Achieve, but it was really driven by the 26 states, which are shown here in blue. And those states did formal reviews at each phase of the process and made considerations for adopting the standards. And as many of you know, Rhode Island became the first state to adopt the standards on May 23rd. Many of the states in gray that you'll see here are also making considerations for adopting as well. So even not being as closely involved in the development process, they have the option of considering that as well. So let's take a closer look here at a performance expectation. Here's drawn straight from the standards. And you'll see that each performance expectation includes the practices, as well as specific related disciplinary core ideas, and then a related cross-cutting concept. This one happens to be energy and matter for this example. A key thing to note is that what's shown in the box here and that's the fact that the performance expectations are not what is to be taught in the classroom, but rather what students should know at the end of instruction and be able to show on assessment. So just a quick overview of the standards themselves, and hopefully that caught everyone up to speed. And at this point, I will go ahead and introduce our presenters. We have Cindy Hmelo-Silver and Rebecca Jordan joining us from Rutgers. And now I will turn it over to Cindy and Rebecca. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So we're going to talk today about the cross-cutting concept, structure, and function, but we're going to start by first introducing ourselves and then finding out a little bit about you. So I am Cindy Hmelo-Silver. I am an educational psychologist and a professor at Rutgers University. I study how people learn about complex systems. In particular, I work on developing technology to help middle school children get experience with phenomena that they can't normally see. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you tonight. And now there's the picture that's supposed to go.
Sorry, minor difficulty. Thank you, Cindy. I am Rebecca Jordan. I'm a behavioral biologist and teacher educator. I've conducted morning research with fish and mammals, and those mammals include...
Rebecca, sorry to interrupt. Can you come a little bit closer to your mic?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Did I move? All right. And I am, again, most interested in studying how people learn science both inside and outside of school. And I am mainly interested in the development of models as explanations for biological and environmental patterns and phenomena. Tonight we are particularly excited about talking about cross-cutting ideas in science. In particular, we have a keen interest in systems thinking, and therefore a lot of what we do and study overlaps with the particular cross-cutting concept of structure and function, and as it relates to causal explanations and modeling as well. But first, we'd like to hear a little bit from you guys. First of all, we are wondering at what grade level, we saw there's a number of teachers on here earlier, what grade level are folks teaching? So go ahead and stamp that. I see folks are already doing that. That's great to give us a sense. Let's take a quick moment. Excellent. And now give us a sense of the disciplines that you represent here. Okay, all right. All life science educators. Hi. Representing the physical sciences. Know what's going on with chemistry? You guys gotta get more folks on. Okay, so it looks like we're fairly, there you go, chemists. We are fairly across the board in the disciplines you represent. So that's great. Thank you. Folks are still adding, but we'll move on. Let's first think about the standard associated with, or not the standard, the cross-cutting concept rather, associated with the next generation science standards. The NGSS state that the shape and stability of structures of natural and designed objects are related to their function. The functioning of natural and built systems alike depends on the shapes and relationships of certain key parts, as well as the properties of the materials from which they are made. From this, we'd like to draw your attention in particular to a few keywords. First, we're thinking about the shape and stability of structures, of individual structures, whether they be designed or natural, and the important elements when we think about these structures, right, are these properties that help, I don't want to say help directly, but the properties that are associated with the function or the outcome of these structures. In addition, we can think about structure and function on a broader system level, right? And so now we can think about these, the functioning, or again, this outcome or pattern resulting from the structures that exist within the system and the mechanisms that also are associated with those structures.
And that's a theme that I think you'll see through a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight. The slide we just put up now shows the Next Gen Science Standards progression for this, starting with students in early grades who start really focusing on physical attributes of structures and designed objects and how they relate to their function broadly. As we go up in the grades increasingly, there's a focus on connections across levels and relationships, and increasingly dynamic relationships between structure and function. So what we'd like you to have as your first discussion point, so what you've got here is a picture of a sponge, and we would like you to go into groups and begin to think about how does that sponge accomplish some of the life functions that it needs to undergo. So if you could take a few minutes to think about how a sponge might achieve respiration, breathing, especially when they don't have organs. What is it about the structure that allows that kind of function to happen? So we would like you to take a few minutes in the chat rooms to discuss that.
Mm-hmm. Do that for 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Cindy. So what I'll do, everybody, is I'll send everyone to separate breakout rooms, and you can use the chat there to talk with each other about this question. And I'll set our timer for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and we can discuss further. And for our presenters, I'll just make a note here that we should just mute our microphones while the participants are working. What is being recorded now in our main room will be included in our recording, so we'll just be quiet while our participants work. Okay, everyone, thanks for chatting in our breakout rooms, and now we are all back together in our main room, and I will turn it over to Cindy and Rebecca to continue.
Okay, great. Some of what we saw happening in the chat rooms are discussions about various structures that might enable water movement at some level or another to allow breathing to occur that way. And that's fundamentally, in many ways, the actual point. And so if we look at the Tree of Life's version of the sponge, you can see there are certain fundamental elements in terms of this very simple organism handling the complex task of breathing without organs. And certainly I found many students in my classes, they have a sense of respiration in terms of breathing. And so we, in terms of human breathing rather, and so we have to bring the air into our lungs and remove the air out of our lungs. And so building on that concept, we can talk about how we bring water over these particular structures, and the structures being these various flagella in particular that do help pump water. And the pump works, unlike our lungs, in sort of a one-way process where they bring oxygen and nutrients to the sponge while actually removing the waste and carbon dioxide. And so here is this, again, this fundamental outcome, or this fundamental function, so to speak, where in this case, of course, breathing, but various structures associated enabling this process to occur in the absence of other structures that students especially want to evoke in this explanation. And so we're seeing some individuals talk about, the notion of passive circulation versus active circulation. And because of the way that water flows in the environments where okay, so we're seeing a few other questions. In an environment where the water flow can be multi-directional when it's moving, in some cases can be pretty stale, so you're not getting a lot of water movement at all. And so there is an active process. The flagella are working to pump a little bit, but they are using the general water flow to promote that as well. So we're seeing an exploitation of a passive process, so to speak, where water movement is occurring, but then the flagella moving in a particular direction to take advantage of that and flow it over the particular cells and structures that are necessary. So and in some ways we can look at this from a very narrow perspective, and for you life science teachers, the notion of form and function, right, or structure and function, or the idea that we have different parts in our physiology that can be associated with the various outcomes such as breathing, might seem very familiar and work along lines of what we're accustomed to teaching. Certainly, though, if we're looking at design systems or even biophysics and natural systems, and we're exploiting things like, in this case, thinking about flow and thermodynamics, I think in many ways we can view this the same, that there is a structure that's associated with a particular function, often in these living, and certainly more often in built systems. But there is also this phenomena, so to speak, where there are a number of structures that are not necessarily associated with particular functions that we know. And so that might be something we see a little bit differently in built versus living systems. But if we think about this, and so you may notice as I was speaking that we are toggling a bit between thinking about the flagella, thinking about perhaps a single structure within the body of the sponge, or within this overall system of breathing. But we can think about the subsystem, what's involved in flagella. Are they actively beating flagella? If they are, where's the energy source? Are they passively beating the flagella? And what are they taking advantage of? Things like the environment. And so what I encourage you, what the both of us encourage you to think about too when you're addressing this notion of function, like I said, we often think of associated form and function. In the life sciences, we tend not to think of it perhaps being built to drive that function, but in built systems, without a doubt, the fact that individuals move more quickly on wheels in a car versus squares. I mean, there's elements of the properties of these particular structures that allow them to work, and together they are going to often drive a system. But then we need a place to consider function, right, at the system level, and that to help ourselves reason, and certainly with a number of the teachers we worked with, we chosen to sort of look at functions at the system level as patterns or phenomena. And that'll become clearer, I think, a little bit later in our session. But so we could, pose this a little bit differently and ask the question, and maybe just some show of hands on your next to your names. But how many of you are asking questions like, what happened here, or why do you think that, or how come? Okay, we're getting a number of individuals raising their hands, right? Again, this crosses almost all disciplines. Excellent. We're seeing a number of people raising their hands. Great. So this is a very familiar area. And so we'll move forward, and we argue that really what we're trying to underscore here are explanations, right? We want students to provide explanations for patterns or phenomena in particular systems, ultimately. And again, a system is composed of these structures and their individual mechanism driven by, again, the structural layer of function. And so we're sort of telescoping in to think about function in a very narrow sense when we associate it with form, and then we can telescope out and think about function in a broader sense when we're talking about patterns, phenomena that are associated with systems. So, for example, Hurricane Sandy, right? A number of you are likely familiar with Hurricane Sandy. And one of the biggest surprises that came out of Hurricane Sandy, especially with residents in New Jersey, was they expected to be sort of flooded across the entirety of the shore. And what was found after the storm was that a number of homes right on the shore were just fine, whereas a number of homes inland were not. And so that a number of residents, now of course, land scientists and environmental scientists readily expected the patterns they saw, but a number of the members of the public were confused. And so that's an example. That right there is a phenomenon, an occurrence that can warrant an explanation. And that's sort of a happening type of explanation, so to speak. But even at a basic level for the earth science teachers, let's just say, or anybody who's working with geology, why are we seeing? Is there any explanation for the distribution of stream flow through any system? And so at that level, again, these are these broader level patterns that we are equating to system level functions. So do you folks have other examples of these kind of phenomena or patterns or broad system level functions? Certainly, I'm sure folks in physics do. The chemistry teachers will have to do a little educating for Cindy and I. We can think of a number of life science examples. And so take a moment, maybe about, again, 3 or 4 minutes, just to share amongst yourself, and then have one individual provide in the chat at least an example of the kinds of patterns that you are discussing in your classrooms.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. So everyone, we'll move into breakout rooms again. This time we'll have our discussion prompt copied to your breakout room, and you can talk with each other. I'll set our timer for 3 minutes, and then we'll come back and you can report to us on what you shared. So when we move you to your breakout room in just a minute, you can start typing in your chat window. Okay, everyone, we are all back in our main room now, and you can feel free to type a little bit of a summary of what your group discussed into our chat window.
So Bryn, are we all back in the main room now?
Yes, you can go ahead and continue.
Okay, can we ask somebody from each of the chat rooms to put some of what you found in the chat box, and we'll read some of those off?
Amazing. Certainly, we were able to see some earth science being represented, right? Individuals talking about plate motion, plate tectonics, erosion patterns, activity in the planet. We saw some perhaps biology teachers or earth science or environmental talking about some of the ecosystem patterns, very broad system level patterns. Perhaps some folks in chat room 3 or 4, if you have any ideas, could type them up really quickly. One thing we did note too was that some folks were asking the question of kind of what are we doing, what's happening here, and so what we are doing is sort of toggling again between sort of a very narrow perspective on structures, organisms, built entities, etc., to a much broader perspective of such things in the view of a system. And so why don't we move on and show you a little example that might help make things a bit clearer. And in doing so, we're going to be using some terms that we'd like to introduce you to, and perhaps this might help you to think of various examples that you actually may be teaching currently in the classroom.
So one of the things that we noticed as we were preparing for this was that when we start looking at structure function, we also start seeing it connecting to many of the other cross-cutting concepts. In particular, and in our work, we think about systems thinking as a goal of the kinds of teaching that we do. One of the things that we've found really helpful is to organize instruction around this notion of structure, or helping learners understand that systems have components, that there are behaviors that refer to processes or mechanisms within a system, and the function, as we've talked about, which might be the role of a particular element in the system, or the outcomes or phenomena that are the patterns that we see. So we can think of these locally, what we've been talking about is maybe type 1 functions, where it's really thinking about the small components, as well as globally, as Rebecca said, in thinking about these larger system functions. So it's really helpful to think about what might be the trade-offs and limitations of thinking locally versus globally. And we've found in general that with the middle school children that we work with, this has been a fairly effective way to help them make connections across different parts of the system. So any thoughts, if you want to just put some ideas right into the main chat room, that you might think about in terms of systems thinking, about thinking about these different ways.
Again, here is just an opportunity if folks are feeling a little bit lost too, or want a little further explanation on something, to just feel free to type that up. We are looking at the main chat room, and so if folks don't have anything right now, that's fine as well. But if you're providing something in the main chat room, please feel free to go ahead. We want this to be as interactive as possible, and we certainly, most of all, okay. We are seeing some questions as we monitor the chat room, and
there it is.
So more exact examples that we're just about to give you one. The parts of the pendulum, right, is what somebody else came up with, the notion of pendulum motion, and very interesting example of thinking about the outcome of a pendulum that is cyclic, right? the outcome is this harmonic pattern. And so that's a very fine example of how we can think about this in sort of a non-living systems way. But, and again, what's really appreciated about that example is that often we may say to a student or ask the student, you know, why are we seeing this harmonic pattern? And so they themselves need to think in particular, right, even though the harmonic pattern, that is the sort of the broad system outcome or function that we're talking about, we need to think about what in the pendulum really affords that kind of cycle, right? And the cycle being this kind of behavior or mechanism that may occur. And so the pendulum in itself needs to be considered not in terms of simply a structure, but about the properties of that structure, what elements of that structure is linking it to the mechanism. And that's where we often lose our students, right? They might say, part A does B, you know, or part A really, or part S does F is where our students often tend to go. And we are encouraging the idea of, again, mechanism. And we also have another question about sort of the type 1 thoughts, and we absolutely agree that sort of this very local view of structure and function is something that students really do well. But the idea of like these next level discussions, we agree that these are areas that are a little tougher for students. And when we sort of see the learning outcomes from doing this kind of work or thinking about this level, we really do see students benefit. And so if folks will allow, we will get a bit into math, excellent example for the pendulum. We will move a bit into our example, and so we're looking at all the questions while talking to you. And let's see if we can, as a group, sort of make sense of a particular living system example and how students might actually make sense of this system. And so, very popular for a lot of the earth scientists in the group, maybe even the chemists and the environmental scientists, sometimes some of the biologists, is this issue of fish die-offs, right? We can think about them in the Gulf of Mexico, we can think about them in local streams, we can think about them in area ponds, but this idea that we have a cluster of dead fish appearing and stinky, yes, fish kills. And so the question that you pose to a student when they come to this, kind of why have the fish died? Why are we seeing this? We help them by first directing the phenomena, or talking about the pattern. What warrants the explanation? And in this case, the phenomena is dead fish. That's the outcome, right? That's system level function, so to speak, right? And so thinking about that, students, if you pose such a question, and we have, and to a number of middle school students, high school students, and university students as to what happened, they will get responses like, I don't know, or pollution, or in some ways, something killed the fish, and some folks saying, certainly look upstream to see what happened, and so to help orient the students for this kind of thinking again, I ask them directly, what could have happened? If we're trying to explain what did happen, what could have happened? Fish were once living, now they're not. What ways do living things become not living? And a very simple kind of question. And then we hear things like starvation, not enough oxygen, too much carbon dioxide. I love some of the responses we're getting regarding the possible ways that the fish could have died. And you're great, you're coming up with these similar kinds of elements that students will come up with more often when you rephrase that to what could have happened. And what they're doing when you orient them to that is they're talking about basic mechanisms within a living system. And again, when we think about this, we could look at this very differently when we think about it maybe from the view of pathogens or maybe from the view of water chemistry, right? But we're looking at sort of, we encourage them to kind of evoke mechanisms, and this is the critical piece, evoke mechanisms before they evoke the parts, right? And so that is a difficult aspect for our students to understand. And so what we may do is move them to, okay, based on what we know about the system, or what might we need to know, right? What is plausible? You know, here, if there are no predators, they probably weren't preyed upon, right? And so those kinds of responses, or that will help students sort of tunnel or bring together their multiple ideas to something that may be a lot more directed. The most important aspect of what we encourage the students to focus on, again, we have these mechanisms, we can talk about the structures of the parts that are present, and we can talk about the kinds of processes we know to be plausible. But, yeah, somebody else raised a very good point, right? The fish are found dead, they're not missing, so they're not being eaten. It's that kind of reasoning that we encourage. And really, the important piece are these relationships between mechanisms and structures, right? And that's kind of different than thinking about the function of a particular structure. And instead, so again, function's a funny word in some cases, right? A number of the biologists probably don't, you know, if you're talking about evolution or something broader, don't like the word function. A number of our physiologists are thinking it's critical, right? And perhaps a number of our physical science students are thinking that as well. And so what we want them to do is, again, to really look at take a real look to see what is actually driving, or some of the causal relations behind a particular phenomena. We argue it is these relationships that are of critical importance. And so, folks, again, I can see in the chat room, folks are coming up with some really great ideas, and almost skipping ahead a little bit in this notion of they're looking for evidence directly. But for a number of our students who are maybe a little less versed in a particular system, and what this system could be dead fish, this system could be bicycle going down the road, this system can be a number of equilibrium reactions, this could be the biological pump in the ocean, you know, so there's a number of areas that when we think about a particular system, in this case, we have a very small, you know, ecosystem that
Can I just jump in and answer a question there?
So
somebody asked, does SBF mean structure before function?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, we try to think about it in the opposite way.
Mm-hmm.
So we try really hard to focus the students we work with on thinking about function and mechanism, and think of structures as affording those mechanisms that lead to those functions. Mm-hmm. And this is going to be something we'll come back to again and again, but one of the things that's been a big principle of our work has been really focusing children on function, and trying to get them from just thinking about the pieces of a system. So sorry to interrupt, Rebecca. I just thought that was a really good question and one I wanted to answer.
It does. And so SBF, we're talking about structure, behavior, function, model. And it's really drawn from an example in artificial intelligence, and Cindy had adopted some of these ideas for early classroom work, and the idea was to bring students to think about how the parts, right, might drive an outcome, or how the parts might be related to an outcome. Individuals may say things like, when we think about fish, fish swim, right? And so, you know, fish and swim, so fish is a structure, swim is a function, but, you know, and at that level, maybe. But to uncover this kind of outcome of swim, it turns out that you need a lot more than the word fish. And so for our students, to help them drill more deeply, and that's where it becomes difficult. So we are kind of talking about these structure-function relationships in a broad or narrow sense, but you notice that B is in there, in between, you know, yeah, and so some of this structure leads to function, does leads to equal the mechanism. At some levels, yes, certainly. So the idea, again, is one where we are encouraging our students to drill down, to talk about more of the how in many ways that the structural elements relate to function, right? We can understand structural elements have outcomes. I like how Kelly Lynn added sort of by way of a certain mechanism. That's a great way of thinking about it. But I think that, again, as we pursue this in our own disciplines, when we kind of go to explain our own patterns and phenomena, we want to move students beyond just the idea that, okay, here's a part and it does X, and here's another part and it does Y, and that's wonderful. But how are X and Y related for a broader system outcome? And certainly, what somebody else raised the question as well, that, you know, what happens with kindergarten or a first grader, and we found in some very preliminary work that younger grades, those below the middle grades certainly, are almost a lot better at kind of addressing this question. And so it may not be as intricate as what we're talking about at system level phenomena, and the causal links may not be as intricate, but the idea that that there is a particular part, right, and it is associated with a particular outcome, how is an idea that's particularly appealing to a number of students. And yeah, exactly as Kelly Lynn is mentioning, they are so observant and they're creative. And that creativity is something that we argue really can help them not only account for phenomena, but solve problems. And so, do you have something else to mention?
Yeah, so if we looked at the NGSS progression that we showed earlier, they give an example for younger children of developing a simple model that mimics the function of an animal in dispersing seeds or pollinating plants, as an example. So if you think about, you know, how animals might either eat or drop, excrete seeds or drop seeds, so that might be an example if that helps.
Yeah. And Maureen also raised the question of sort of this function determining structure and structure determining function, and this is always where I personally have always found function to be kind of a difficult word in the sciences, because we can think about it in many different ways. But follow through this example and see what you think about this kind of relationships between structure, behavior, and function. And so again, we argue it's probably a particularly good idea to orient the students. So sometimes if we say something very broadly, like the climate system or something like that, or a pond, model a pond, they'll tell us a lot of great things that we could say, yeah, we know that's true. But by bringing them to a particular outcome, a particular element of the system, or a particular idea, you'll see in a moment can help them to account for the outcomes using mechanism a little more pointedly. And so here we have our example. That individual on that earlier slide noted dead fish. And so we are warranting, the explanation that sort of warrants an answer here is, you know, why are there dead fish? And so if you ask somebody, and we're just going to use sort of a basic kind of concept mapping frame here to introduce some of these ideas. But so if you ask an individual, and we have, Go ahead and draw a model of this outcome. What do you think is happening? They often, we'll start with a fish. No surprise there. Other things that we tend to see them talking about is dead, fish dead, water. There are many dead fish. Bad odor, it likely smells. It looks stinky to them. All true. But then we begin to think about, and we do a little bit more deeply into this notion of properties, right? Structures have particular properties. How do we represent those? And so when we think about that, we encourage, again, fish can be a certain color. That's a property. That's great. Fish can be a certain size. That's a property. That's also great. Are they both relevant to the phenomena at hand? Are they both related to dead fish? That's something that they're going to think about. Again, pushing the relations, encouraging them to elaborate more on the sort of the B behavior mechanism between the S and the F. And so when we do so, and we think about properties, again, and these aren't necessarily right answers, but what we're affording them, we argue, is a language by which they can think and reason about these ideas. And that's ultimately what we're doing here, and perhaps I just said earlier, but this is a conceptual, SBNF is a conceptual representation. So we're not just sort of telling them what to think about, we're telling them how to think about. So we're taking away some of the broad creativity and narrowing them to an explicit language that will help them communicate their ideas and ultimately test them. And so here, you could represent the property, like bad is a property of odor, or maybe bad odor is the property of the water, right? And for the many and the dead, we can say, well, that's true of fish, right? So those are properties, but what happens as we add some other elements to it, right? Like the oxygen. Might the oxygen be too high and too low? And even our youngest of students get the idea that things like water too hot, too cold, not good. Oxygen too high, too low, not good. Trees, and we'll often see this in a number of models, a whole bunch of ideas about what's in that system, what's in the picture they saw or the stream they encountered. But regardless of what they're putting in their structural boxes and their functions, what we're seeing here, sorry, a little click error, is that, again, so we're just peeking on the side there, what we're seeing are these relationships, and that's what matters. How are you accounting for this phenomena with the relationships between these parts, these structures, and again, here is where we think it critical for them to uncover particular function. Now the fish may have a function in this system of being sort of living and dead. And if we're talking about the overall pond system, right, we could think about fish, as playing a number of functional roles, right? Fish can move water by swimming. Fish can eliminate algae by eating, right? So there's a number of functions sometimes that we can relate to parts. It's true of the body, right? An arm can do a number of things, right? Or the various bones within an arm, right? We can move them in a number of orientations to help us complete certain elements. And so even if we boil down to joints and think, well, a joint serves a particular function, we could look a little deeper and find that there are more parts within that system. And so that's the kind of thinking, again, that moves students away from ending with the first thing they think about as a structure as necessarily being the function, and they're all done. And so by thinking about properties, right, as we saw in the cross-cutting concept, properties associated with these structures, like there were many fish. Might that be important to why they died, right? The oxygen. If there are many fish, it might drive the oxygen to be too low. And maybe that's why the fish died, right? Or dead. The dead fish might be related to the bad odor, right? And maybe that's, something important. Is it related to the dead fish? Does bad odor kill fish? These are the kinds of questions and the kinds of observations we push our students to make. And then, And again, here, great, you drew a beautiful concept map, but now we want to push it even farther to think about these kinds of relations, right? We saw lots of fish could use up the oxygen, and fish need oxygen to live. And then here's the part where a number of folks were in the main chat room a few moments ago, right? What is your evidence for that? Well, we can talk about things we've learned. So when you say, well, why will fish die if there's no more oxygen left? We need oxygen, right? They can talk about respiration because they're aware of it. They're, you know, depending on your age group, or you can even talk about cellular respiration. And then in this case, right, what they also may have had other data from personal experience that can be discussed here. Is that sufficient? And so now we're encouraging them to think about what constitutes evidence and what constitutes data. And again, we can think of numerous examples that individuals can use in the physical sciences and beyond. The main point here is that, and again, this process can continue until students come up with a plausible model that they can test. The process could continue till students say, we need some more data. And then we send them out and they use those data to actually draw more relations. And again, notice so many of the words we're using here. Now we're talking about models, right? That's a practice in the next generation science standards that we can think about as well. And the ultimate goal is this model that accounts for evidence and is a plausible explanation of what could be happening. And like I said, it could be a platform to test subsequent ideas. In that example, you'll note the idea of function, right, at that level 1, right, where we're now talking about, perhaps we could talk about gills, right? The gills are related to the oxygen, right? So if perhaps there was a chemical found, that often could cause the gills not to work. So the gills, right, are related in terms of respiration, right? And then we can think about the fish swimming. And now in this case, swimming is related to this mechanism of pushing water over the gills. It's not necessarily related to swimming to help them find their food. And that kind of again, that's where we're pushing them a little deeper to move beyond, okay, here's a structure and this might be what it does, or this is what it does. And again, we're seeing that at that level 1. Or we can think about it in a broader sense and say, well, why did the fish die, right? And then again, that is a system level function. So when you read that in the standards, and if you recall what we mentioned earlier, when you're looking at that cross-cutting concept, you're looking at this kind of level 1 function related to structures and again mechanisms. And then you're looking again when they start evoking the idea of system at a level 2 level of functions. And so ultimately they are the same. What it really boils down to is how far you're telescoping in or out of the system, and thinking about a system as comprising smaller systems as comprising smaller systems. And that's where students often, they have a difficulty in thinking across these kinds of parallels and moving in and out of concepts. So to ensure that this may or may not be making sense to you, I would like everyone to grab a piece of paper. Hopefully folks are in an area where they can do that, or find a piece of chalk or some kind of implement that you could scratch on a sidewalk or wherever you may be, to draw a model. And this model in particular is kind of how to lower an individual's blood pressure. We picked it because it's kind of a random question. We aren't often asked this, and then discuss. Let's say we'll give you 3 minutes to draw a very light, easy model. And then we'll give you another 3 minutes to discuss in your group, so that way we can come up with a few things that are out in the main chat room, and then we'll bring it back together.
And Rebecca, I think for purposes of time, we'll go ahead and just keep everybody in the same main chat room, because we've got some good synergy going with the discussion. But I will set our timer for 3 minutes to give folks a chance to do their drawing. And then after that, we can start taking the comments in the chat.
Okay, great.
Okay, everyone, that is our 3-minute timer bell for your drawing exercise, and I know that we've got some great comments coming into the chat, and we'll go ahead and take more of those now. I will turn it back over to Rebecca and Cindy to comment on everyone's thoughts there in the chat.
Okay, thanks. And we're seeing a number of different responses. And so we're having individuals realize that systems can be quite complicated, and this is helping them move beyond that a little bit, which is helpful. You know, and I love the idea that that we can think of a question always leads to another question, and that's the idea that we encourage. And so, you know, and Rachel mentioned a question that we're going to address a little later about sort of templates and things like that that could be used. And so, okay, here we have some responses. The idea of diet and exercise and blood pressure, right? And other people we're talking about exercise, right? And clearly some folks are thinking about summer vacation while they think about exercise related to blood pressure, reducing stress at work, salt, financial worries, right? Body position, excellent, and certainly. And again, some folks mentioning wine, various ways to relax. Great, we thought somebody, I knew it, so thanks guys.
Bloodletting.
Somebody would mention bloodletting, and it's true, right? Excellent. And so pill bottles, great. And these are the various kinds of examples that folks may, you know, would certainly come up with in that question. And many encourage somebody to actually seek medical attention is great. But what really underscores this, and number one, the kind of, you guys have come up with explanations. You've come up with phenomena, right? And it's, well, the phenomena really is to lower the blood pressure. I'm sorry. You guys have come up with mechanisms, is the word I wanted to use, for how to do this. Now, how are these structures related to that mechanism? And so, in a sense, the model, so to speak, that we could be thinking about is, you know, if we're talking about blood pressure, you know, fundamentally, I'm not so good with our drawing tool here, sorry, I'm giving you lots of stars. And so if we have this notion of blood pressure, I'm an excellent screen artist here, you can see. This notion of blood pressure being a central feature, right? And we want to, you know, if somebody's blood pressure is too high, how do we lower that is the result, right? A number of individuals understood basically the idea of circulation, right? And a lot of that has to do with basic fluid dynamics, right, related to our physicists. And so, you know, we could think about that, and we can think about a whole sort of lowering blood pressure via mechanism of, you know, putting a hole in the pressure system, right, by bloodletting. We could think about mechanisms that relate to what could happen, where we're talking about pills. Pills in many respects work, again, on that blood system by, in many cases, just opening up, right, opening up the vessels wider. All right, so you have to trust me on what these things say. We'll practice ahead of time, and that's as we can come up with. But the notion that we have a closed system, we have a closed series of tubes, so to speak. If we're going to lower that pressure, we need to open up those tubes. We need to think about the pressure pump, right? And that is the heart. And the number of medications will affect the heart as well. We can think about, again, simply perforating the system, and that may relate to capillaries and how we can open those. A number of individuals are exploiting this kind of pressure system by moving the heart and the body, right? And that's certainly a great way to reduce blood pressure. And so what you've done, in a sense, if you recall in our previous discussion where we sort of talked about plausible mechanisms, right? You've got those here. And you know, with the other examples that we've also just mentioned. So we drill into a particular mechanism, right? Like, again, why would this whole idea of bloodletting, right, putting holes in the system, you know, why might, or how does that result in lower blood pressure, right? And so the idea, again, that students would really want to uncover, so it's not just the idea that, okay, heart and blood pressure and blood vessels maintain pressure, so if we want to lower it, we have to work on those, right? So we've talked about the function, we talked about the structure, but the work on those, that's the mechanism, and that's where a number of people have evoked that. I'm not sure if that's where people were drawing with their models, but if they were, excellent, because that's that kind of mechanistic thinking. And so we can say something to the, we can relate to now we can think about some of the structures, right? And we can think about the heart as our pump. And again, here what are we doing? We're talking about analogies, right, in our thinking. So the heart is this pump. We can think about our vessels at various levels. We can even think about, you know, the huge leech or whatever we're going to use to perforate the system. And so, or a knife or something at that level. And what you can see is that we have these various structures, right? How are they related to each other? And that's where we're encouraging students to dig a little deeper. Now, when folks were drawing their models, were they putting together something kind of like this? And so, little.
Can you raise your hands if you were doing that?
Yeah, let's hear some things. Okay, were you, okay, we got some folks. Okay. All right, so we're hearing some people do that. And so that's great. People were really thinking about the mechanisms related to that, right? And even some of these physics teachers, right, did some of this resonate with you guys regarding something like thermodynamics? Any shout out from the physics teachers out there? Well, it's not, perhaps it could, as you think about that system, and a system, a closed system, and a pump, in a bicycle sense, and how that may relate to pressure, or how you might reduce pressure if that bicycle tires were popped, or something at that level. And so if we, and again, we're doing these things, and we're talking about it, but it still begs the question of, think about these at these different levels and really probing for mechanism. Does it actually help students to think about some of these cross-cutting concepts in a more sophisticated manner?
So in our work, we try and teach about structure, behaviors, and function, or structures, mechanism, and function together as a conceptual representation. We do this for a number of reasons. First of all, because in our research studying experts, we find that this is, I think somebody earlier asked if this was how scientists reason, and indeed they do. People who know a lot about a domain do tend to reason in terms of structures, behaviors, and functions. We also find that it's a way to help bring together other cross-cutting concepts like systems, like cause and effect, and patterns, scale and proportion, stability and change, and we'll give you some examples of that in the context of our own work. It also provides opportunities to bring together scientific practices like models and representations, as well as explanations, and helps promote outcomes that are related to the next generation science standards. So when we talk about structure, behavior, function thinking as a conceptual representation, we think of it as a tool for students to think with. It gives them a language. It helps them develop a schema for thinking about systems for both natural and designed phenomena. And when we've done this work in the past, and I think we're not going to have a lot of time for discussion now, so we know that the teachers that we've worked with, we teach a lot about, we situate a lot of our work in thinking about aquatic systems, but the teachers that we work with have taken this to units that focus on human body systems, on designing model rockets, genetics. So the teachers we work with have found this really useful in a number of settings. In our work, and I'm just going to give you an example, and you can find the tools we use at the web address on the bottom. We use this Systems and Cycle SBF toolkit to allow learners to experience complex systems phenomena in real-world contexts. So we use a combination of real-world along with the structure, behavior, function framework to teach about the use of models. We use function-oriented hypermedia, and again, all of our hypermedia are available. We use agent-based simulations that let students see function and mechanism and these patterns at both a macro level and then at a micro level. And part of our work as we use modeling tools with them is to help them think about how these macro and micro levels are connected. So this allows students to organize, record, and revise their ideas because we want to make explicit the notion that students have to revise their thinking. In some of our work in the classroom, we conjecture that teaching ecosystem processes and mechanism alongside components and structures will support students in transferring their ideas when they encounter novel ecosystems. And this is in contrast to the way most textbooks and curriculum are often organized, in which they focus on structures in isolation or isolated structures and functions. So we think of structure, behavior, function thinking as a conceptual glue. As we frame our units, we start out by presenting the phenomena, so it may be that the fish have died. We start by asking students to draw models. We have them do it on paper. We engage them with evidence related to the phenomena, and some of this will be reports of what people have found. It might be newspaper articles. Some of it will be simulations. And we then ask the students to refine their model with a focus on structure, behaviors, and functions. So what's the problem, the phenomena, or the function? What are the structures or components that drive the functions in the problem? And what are the mechanisms or behaviors that connect the structures and function to the system? Mm-hmm. So just really quickly, we'll go through, here's the macro level where students can see carrying capacity in a system and model that. We can let them observe the micro level as they look at nitrification in the system. And we have some more complex simulations where they combine ecosystem processes to look at cellular respiration, photosynthesis, and decomposition.
And one of the areas, again, that you saw in our initial conjecture was this notion of transfer. And so when somebody posed earlier, and we said we'd get to that really quickly, the idea that, you know, how can these sort of level 2 kinds of functions help students to be able to more deeply understand the processes or the elements that about which we teach, one of the things we're interested in, and it's okay from an ecosystem perspective, if we teach something here, like photosynthesis, do we have to reteach it whenever we see a new tree, a new ecosystem, a new park? And a number of you bio teachers might say yes. And again, there's probably like examples in chemistry and physics where, and we found even with our sort of very simple drawing tasks, that pre this kind of reasoning, and we ask them to model a system, students tend to be quite literal. They tend to be quite, you know, pictorial.
Especially at the beginning.
At the beginning, yeah. And they tend to explain stories in terms of single linear kinds of scenarios. And so here we might say this is sort of pre an aquatic ecosystem. And then if we look at the same student who drew this aquatic ecosystem after we provided them a language by which they can address questions as to what is happening here, is the simple question posed, you know, some of the things they transferred maybe weren't as great, like the fact that some of them have put heaters in natural systems, but well, some of the ideas you're going to see here are much more sophisticated, right? And so they are drawing relations between parts instead of the first thing I think about, let me draw. And they're actually attempting to account for particular phenomena, and that is great. But we taught them to do so, and they're learning. Wonderful. But here is where things kind of get exciting. If we ask students to draw a totally unrelated ecosystem, and here we have this beautiful example of birds flying and trees, and whatnot. When we look at them drawing a novel ecosystem, we've given no instruction about anything happening terrestrially, right? They have not had that yet. These students have not. And yet they remember that, something like photosynthesis being taught as a broader mechanism, right? And maybe as a subsystem, right, where plant getting food is our function or our outcome, right? And they're being encouraged to look at the parts, all those chlorophyll, the various little cells, and saying, okay, we don't want to just know that those parts equal photosynthesis. We want to know how, right? And as we drill out further, photosynthesis relates to other aspects in the ecosystem, right? Great, but how? And that kind of drilling into mechanism is of critical importance, and that's where we're seeing, even when they encounter new ideas, they're able to approach it in a more sophisticated manner. And we argue it's because they have questions, they have a framework, they have a mindset that they can address with themselves to encounter or deal with new problems.
So one of the ways that we've been trying to look has been to give the students these short drawing tasks. So we give them a drawing task before we start, and we work with the students over several units. We give them a drawing task every week or two, and we can look at the development of their sophistication. And we tend to see it as a multidimensional trajectory. So we look at how increasingly complex their relations among structured behavior functions are. We look at the degree to which they connect biotic and abiotic at macro and micro level, and we look at the degree to which they are able to take out the extraneous items from their drawings, like the castles and the scuba divers. Mm-hmm. And we found that that's both a useful tool to let us understand how students learn, but we think that for teachers it will also be a really useful formative tool, because it's something you can look at very, very quickly. So some may be able to do this kind of literal drawing, others may lend themselves to more concept mapping, but I would encourage you to think about what kinds of representations might be useful for you to help make students' thinking visible. Mm-hmm. Because I think one of the challenges here is that this is complex, and trying to see where students are at any given point, it can be challenging for teachers. Some of the challenges that we found in teaching about structure and function is the notion of natural compared with design systems. So in natural system, we don't want to talk about a purpose in something, in some function. We want to really avoid teleological reasoning, but in a design system, that is the function. Other challenges that we've seen are students connecting across levels in macro and micro levels, in biotic and abiotic, in what's happening at perhaps a molecular level and what's mm-hmm. happening at an aggregate level. So I'm stretching here a little bit because most of my experience has been with life science. So those are some of the things that we think of, and let me turn it over to Rebecca to finish up.
And so what we are encouraging, I suppose, at this point, because the task at hand for many of you, as you realize, and certainly after listening to the other webinars, is in a way you have to integrate the concepts that you teach into the kinds of practices that folks are talking about with respect to science, not just what scientists may do in a single setting, but how ideas are ultimately communicated and what happens to those ideas. And then you're expected to address, when doing so, these cross-cutting concepts or ideas that that sort of permeate all of the sciences at very similar levels. And that's a difficult challenge. And so what, again, we encourage is not necessarily to replace our instruction with, with things that kind of fit these standards or this perspective of how things go, but we are encouraging you to think about what you're teaching, and it's great to see on the left-hand side that folks are really talking about some really complex ideas in terms of how they might teach this, or what some of the take-home messages might be, or how they would assess things, or what if one individual says things don't lend themselves well to drawing? What about other ways that that individuals represent ideas? And so what again that we are encouraging is to break it down to the heart of the matter, the fundamental questions, the fundamental whys or hows that we know that individuals possess, whether or not they are, elementary students all the way up to high school students and even beyond. What I encourage you to do is to build on those and encourage them, give them a language, give them tools, give them ways to reason about these things, and just let them go and see what they come up with, and at any given time to push a little more deeply, push these questions, push the mechanisms.
Okay.
And so with that, we are finished, and we could take questions, or if Bryn needs to end the session. We also encourage folks to go to our Weebly site. We can perhaps address any particular questions. If folks are interested in this kind of language, regardless of their discipline, we can certainly help them find resources. We are aware of a number of individuals who use this in many different ways. And so anything we could do to be of a resource or of help to you, we are certainly glad to do so.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca and Cindy. I think in the interest of time, we will go ahead and move on to our final portion, but then if the two of you are available, we can come back after our evaluation and do a little informal chatting. And thank you also for the offer to go to the Weebly as well. And folks, I'll just remind everybody about our NSTA resources related to the NGSS. We want to direct you to the standards website as well as our NSTA page that has everything you need for learning about the standards. I also want to point out that we have our members-only listserv on the NGSS, as well as our discussion forum there in the NSTA Learning Center. As I mentioned earlier, it's a great place to continue talking about what you learned tonight and meet with other science teachers. Please do join us next Tuesday for the final program on cross-cutting concepts. I put the link to register there in our chat window, and we look forward to seeing you there. I see a question in the chat about the archive for tonight. That is also going to be put on the same link later this evening, so check that out. You can get these resources in our NSTA store related to the standards and the framework. So if you need access to those, you can click on that link. And I also encourage everybody to check out future NSTA conferences. We've got a good lineup in the fall, as well as our national conference next spring in Boston. So do check it out at the link I just put into the chat. Again, a big thank you to Cindy and Rebecca. So much great information today, and thank you for the ability to interact and share in our chat window. Everyone, we can use our emoticon button, that's the one with the face on it, and select our clapping hands to give our presenters a round of applause. I would like to thank the sponsor of today's web seminar, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And I'd also like to give a thank you to the administration of NSTA for their support for web seminars. And before we close, just a quick look at our upcoming calendar. Come back on Monday, June 10th to join us to learn more about using our portfolio tool and the Learning Center. And again, as I mentioned, June 11th, our final Cross-Cutting Concepts web seminar. And on June 12th, a great program in our NASA Explorer Schools series. So go to learningcenter.nsta.org/webseminars to register for these programs and more, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on another web seminar.